Welcome you all again. We are delighted to have Soyica Diggs Colbert here with us tonight. Soyica is the interim dean of Georgetown College at Georgetown University, where she is also the Idle Family Professor of African American Studies and Performing Arts. She has fellowships from the National Endowment of Humanities to support residency at the Schomburg Center, Woodrow Wilson Foundation, Stanford University, Mellon Foundation, and the Robert W. Woodruff Library at Emory University. She is also the Associate Director at the Shakespeare Theater Company in Washington, D.C. Colbert is the author of Black Movements, Performance and Cultural Politics, the African American Theatrical Body. Colbert has co-edited Race and Performance After Repetition and The Psychic Hold of Slavery. Most recently, she has served as the creative content producer for the Public Theater's audio play, Shadowland. Her research interests span the 19th to 21st centuries, from Harriet Tubman to Beyonce, from poetics to performance. Soyica is here with us today to discuss her journey in writing Radical Vision, a biography of Lorraine Hansberry. Soyica, I pass it to you, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to share some of the context for writing my biography of Lorraine Hansberry. I'm going to share my screen with some images that will help guide the conversation. But as was mentioned, if folks have questions or comments, please feel free to drop them in the chat, and I will try to make sure I'm keeping my eyes in two places at once, although it sometimes can be difficult. But if not, please feel free also to just jump in. So I want to begin with just giving some background. So as was mentioned, I wrote two books before writing Radical Vision: The African American Theatrical Body, which is a book that explores 20th century African American drama and begins by thinking some about Hansberry's most well-known play, A Raisin in the Sun. And my second book, Black Movements, is about late 20th and early 21st century Black performance and thinking in terms of performing arts, and how artists of the late 20th and early 21st centuries were wrangling with the histories and legacies of the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement. And so upon finishing my second book, I began to think about what I wanted to write about next. And I returned to my earlier work on Lorraine Hansberry, but also some of the questions I had been asking about the civil rights generation when writing Black Movements. And so I had the opportunity to have a fellowship at the Schomburg Center in New York City, the Harlem branch of the New York Public Library, where Lorraine Hansberry's papers are stored. And I must admit my own arrogance. When I went to the Schomburg, I thought that I would have a relatively easy time wading through Hansberry's archive, because I had the misperception that I think is maybe part of a public misperception, that the scale of work that is published by Lorraine Hansberry reflects the scale of her writing. I was pleasantly surprised when I found out and realized, once I went to the Schomburg, how much Hansberry had written while she was alive in her short time on the earth. So Hansberry was born in 1930, and she died tragically in 1965. So had a very short life, but produced volumes of work that are now stored at the Schomburg. So she has several plays that were never published, novels, poetry, letters, essays, all of which are in unpublished form at the Schomburg, which is in addition to all of her published work, which is readily available to us. And so not only did I have an opportunity to engage with her vast archive at the Schomburg, but thanks to her trust, I was also able to quote from several of the unpublished works in my volume. And so I want to begin by offering you some insight into how I frame Radical Vision, then talk some about Hansberry's most well-known play, A Raisin in the Sun, which was really my entry point into writing about Hansberry, and then talk some more about the book. And so while at the Schomburg, I stumbled across this journal entry from Hansberry. It was written on March 11th, 1964. Hansberry writes, "Daddy died, Raisin opened, and yesterday I got a divorce. All on March 10, 1945, 1959, 1964. Clearly a faithful day in my life if nothing else ever happens on it." All of these moments, Hansberry's father passing away, A Raisin in the Sun opening, and her getting a divorce marked moments of loss for Hansberry, as well as moments that will be turning points in her art and activism. Hansberry's most well-known play, A Raisin in the Sun, is driven by the question of what happens to a dream deferred, which is a line taken from her mentor and friend Langston Hughes's poem, Harlem. The play asks the question of what happens to a dream deferred for each of its characters. The turning point of the play, or the inciting action, is that Lena Younger, the mother in the play, is left a $10,000 insurance payment from her late husband, Walter Lee Sr. Throughout the play, the characters wrangle with what Mama should do with the insurance money. Should she use it to support her daughter Benitha's education? Benitha aspires to become a physician. Should she use it to support her son, Walter Lee Jr.'s interest in starting his own business? Or should she use it to invest in a home and a house that she and her daughter-in-law, Ruth Younger, both aspire to have? The Youngers do not have enough resources to support all three of the dreams. And so the play takes a good deal of time questioning which one of the dreams Mama will support. But the play also ties that question to a larger conversation that's happening in the United States at the time. A Raisin in the Sun premiered on Broadway in 1959. It follows on the heels of World War II, which coincided with the end of World War II, which coincided not only with some of the highest marriage rates in US history, as the graph on the left shows, but also the baby boom, which we associate with the Great Generation, and the GI Bill, which enabled many Americans who had heretofore not been able to purchase homes to do so. And so the end of World War II and the GI Bill also coincide with the growth of the middle class and the expansion of home ownership in the United States. These statistical moments point to how we come to understand the American dream as being tied to the nuclear family and having a single unit home, the ability for middle-class Americans to purchase a home, and the rise in marriage rates. This was not only reflected in the demographic shifts that were happening after World War II, but also in popular culture. To the right, I have an image from Arthur Miller's My Two Sons, which was similar to Hansberry, a play on Broadway in the mid-20th century that was a kitchen sink drama, a realist drama about an American family that was wrangling with some of the possibilities and limitations happening after World War II for US families. Hansberry grew up in a nuclear family with two educated parents who had all of the trappings of the American dream. Carl Augustus and Nanny Louise Perry Hansberry were both college educated, born in the South, and part of the Great Migration. Carl, born in 1895, was only one generation removed from slavery. As we know, the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery passed in 1865. And so Carl, born in 1895, was both one generation removed from slavery and also part of the Great Migration, which occurred in the early 20th century when millions of African Americans moved from the southern states to northern ones to pursue greater opportunities. Carl was among them. He not only was a college graduate, he also had a Juris Doctorate and was an attorney. And so in Chicago, Nanny and Carl functioned as what we might today call a power couple. Nanny taught school, and Carl began to amass a small empire by buying up real estate on the south side of Chicago, and along with some of his peers, sectioning it off into apartments to create more housing for the other Southern migrants, the other Black Southern migrants that were coming to northern US cities. In 1940, at the time, young Lorraine was only 10 years old, Carl got into a legal battle that would ultimately become part of US history. As a part of Carl's real estate acquisitions, he purchased a home on the south side of Chicago that was currently governed by a racially restrictive housing covenant. What that means is that the community members in this neighborhood had decided that they would only sell their homes to other white community members. But one of the community members broke this covenant and sold their house to Carl Hansberry. And so this set off a series of events of the neighbors suing to try to restrict the Hansberrys from being able to enter the home, from being able to claim ownership of the home. So while Carl began to battle for his legal right to purchase the home, Nanny was protecting her children who were being jeered at, spit upon, and harassed as they came in and out of the household. Ultimately, this case would be heard before the Supreme Court. And so while Nanny is at home protecting her children, as Hansberry recalls in a journal entry, they were sitting in their home one day and a piece of concrete came flying through their window and it almost hit young Lorraine. Carl was off in Washington, D.C., battling for his family's right to occupy the home. Ultimately, the Supreme Court found in Hansberry v. Lee that the Hansberrys did have the right to purchase that home in that neighborhood. They did not find, as Carl had hoped, that racially restrictive housing covenants were illegal in general. So Carl won the battle but lost the war for civil rights. This is an important turning point for young Lorraine because she both has an early introduction to the ways that the juridical might inform civil rights battles, and she also has a model for self-defense that her mother gives her as she is taking care of the family in Carl's absence. For those of you who know Raised in the Sun, you might already see how Hansberry's experience as a child informed her rendering in the play. A Raisin in the Sun is the first play by a Black woman to premiere on Broadway, and it almost doesn't happen. A Raisin in the Sun is produced by a friend of Hansberry and her husband, Carl Nimroff. They are novice producers. Hansberry is a first-time playwright. The director of the play is a newcomer to Broadway, and this is the first time not only to have a play by a Black woman on Broadway, but also very rare to have a realist drama with primarily African American actors. So for several reasons, A Raisin in the Sun is improbable and also historic. The play appears on Broadway again in 2004 and once again in 2014, marking its impact on American culture. One of the central themes of the play is intergenerational conflict. As I mentioned before, there are three central women in the play: Mama, Ruth, and Benitha. Ruth is Walter Lee's wife and Mama's daughter-in-law, and Benitha is Mama's daughter. There's a scene in the play where the two older women are questioning Benitha about some of her relationships. And she responds, "I don't know if I'm going to get married at all. All I know is I want to become a doctor." The two older women are notably surprised by Benitha's proclamation that she doesn't know whether or not she's going to get married at all. Because as I suggested, not only was the play taking place right on the heels of one of the heights of marriage within the United States statistically, but marriage was also the means by which many women were able to find financial security. And so marriage meant a possibility not only for the individual woman, but for her family as well. While many Americans were climbing into the middle class, though the ways in which they were able to do that often depended on gender. And so for women, this meant heterosexual coupling and being tied to a man who was able to support them for many women. Similarly, the play depicts a conflict between Walter Lee and his mother. As I mentioned, Walter Lee aspires to be a business owner and to own a liquor store. Walter Lee and Mama get into a conversation because she questions the prudence of giving Walter Lee the money to invest in something that she sees as a risky proposition. And she says to him, "At one point, freedom was life. Now I see it's money." The line also resonates profoundly as we remember that Lena is of the same generation as Hansberry's father, who is only one generation removed from slavery. And so thinking about how freedom functioned for Mama's generation versus that of Hansberry and the character Walter Lee is important for us to understand what the play is trying to do in terms of us understanding the particular circumstances of this Black family, this Black middle-class family, or working-class family, I should say. The play also does a good job of drawing our attention to the political wranglings that were happening during the time period. So as I said, this is 1959 in the United States, and it is the heyday of the prototypical American family. We're also in the midst of the Cold War and the burgeoning years of the Civil Rights Movement. One of Benitha's suitors in the play is an exchange student named Assegai. And he draws attention to Hansberry's understanding of the independence movements that are happening in Africa in the 1940s and 50s. At the end of the play, Walter Lee has the opportunity to sell his home back to the community from which Mama has purchased it for a profit. And so ultimately, Mama decides to invest in a home for her family, to buy a house. But similar to Hansberry's family, she buys a house in a segregated community. And so the community decides, as did with the Hansberry family, to try to repurchase the home back at a profit. Walter Lee must decide whether or not he wants to sell the house back and retain the profits, or whether he wants to move into the house. And so whenever I'm teaching this play to my students, there's often a debate about whether or not the younger should move into the house. Ultimately, Walter Lee decides to move. The line he uses is that we will occupy the house. But one of the things that is important to know is that Hansberry is not making a declaration in the play about the prudence of integration or not, but rather she's making a statement about the necessity of taking affirmative steps towards freedom, and that Walter Lee's decision to move is one step in a building block towards what she sees as a more democratic society. Hansberry learned from her parents about the civil rights movement before what we would understand as the classic phase of the civil rights movement. Most historians bookend the classical phase of the civil rights movement as beginning in 1954 with the passing of Brown v. Board of Education and ending in 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. But Hansberry was reared in households and with mentors that gave her exposure to the civil rights movement well before 1954. This slide shows some of Hansberry's mentors, and some of these faces may be familiar to you. To the top left is Lorraine Hansberry. The top right is Alice Childress, who is also a playwright and recently had a play on Broadway. Childress's play Trouble in Mind was set to go to Broadway in 1955, but ultimately did not premiere there. And so 50 years later, we finally saw Childress's play Trouble in Mind on Broadway just this season. W.E.B. Du Bois, who was also a mentor to Hansberry and has said that she was one of his best students. Louis Burnham, who was Hansberry's teacher and editor when Hansberry first moved to New York in 1950. And Paul Robeson, who was again a mentor of Hansberry's, an actor and an activist, and who hired Hansberry to work on his journal Freedom, where Louise Burnham was the editor of the journal. This slide shows an article that Hansberry wrote about Kenya's independence movement when she was writing for freedom in the early 1950s. Again, it demonstrates her awareness of independence movements happening in Africa well before they become central to many American activist mindset. For the most part, we see the influence of African independence movements and Black freedom struggles in the US post-1965. But Hansberry was well aware of the impact and the importance of understanding what was happening in Africa and Latin America in the early 1950s. This emerges again in her play Le Blanc, which she writes as she's dying in 1964 and 1965. And so Hansberry is thinking about these questions of independence from the 1950s well until the end of her life. This is also a short story that Hansberry writes under a pseudonym about Henry Box Brown, who was an enslaved African American who ran away. And it shows that Hansberry was writing in lots of different forms throughout her life. So although we primarily know her as a playwright, she was also a journalist. She wrote short stories, and as I mentioned before, drafted novels and other prose fiction while she was alive. In 1962, Hansberry gave a speech during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The speech is important because it draws attention to Hansberry's understanding of how history works. And so some of the primary concerns of the Cuban Missile Crisis were thinking about the impending threat it had on the US and our civilization. But one of the things that Hansberry was well aware of from her childhood, and then as a student of history, was how the perpetual state of crisis for Black people living in the United States. And so in Hansberry's speech, she not only touches on the immediate implications of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but she also links that crisis to a larger frame of instability within Black history, and think some about how that is connected to some of the civil unrest that's happening in the civil rights movement in the early 1960s.
My government is wrong.
Sorry. Those ideas are part of Hansberry's engagement about crises, how to manage it, freedom and responsibility, are connected to Hansberry's understanding of the existentialist movement. The existentialist movement was a movement that was primarily driven by French philosophers following World War II. And again, it was a way for thinkers to try to grapple with the massive losses that happened following World War II, specifically the Holocaust. Hansberry was most informed by the writing of Simone de Beauvoir, who is best known for the book Second Sex. Hansberry latches on to the existentialist thinkers because one of their principal tenets is that each individual has the ability to shape his or her impact on the world through day-to-day activities, and that those activities can expand one's freedom and can also have an impact on how they might flourish and impact the world. And so Hansberry could not think in terms of despair, which was a predominant focus of life following World War II. So even as you had the opportunity that emerged after World War II with the baby boom and an expansion of the middle class, there was also this presiding sense of existentialist dread as individuals were trying to come to terms with all of the losses of World War II. And so this idea of despair was really proliferating throughout philosophical circles in this time period. But for Hansberry, she could not think in terms of despair or in terms of happiness, but she was thinking in terms of freedom. And again, that was why the existentialists served to be a really important touchstone for her. Hansberry had all of these different philosophical, political, and social information that was informing her. And so the images here hope to draw attention to Hansberry's multiplicity. The sketches on the left and the right are self-portraits by Lorraine Hansberry. And the one in the middle is an image taken for Vogue magazine in 1959 after Hansberry's historic run of Raisin in the Sun on Broadway, and she's interviewed for Vogue. Again, all of the images here seek to draw attention to the different facets of Lorraine Hansberry, both the public figure that we know very well is associated with the Raisin in the Sun, as well as an outspoken activist, an intellectual, an artist, and a friend. In 1963, there is a well-known meeting that Hansberry has with Bobby Kennedy alongside alongside Harry Belafonte, James Baldwin, and Jerome Smith. And so this is 1962. And Hansberry meets with then Attorney General Bobby Kennedy because he has been asked by his brother, JFK, to manage the civil unrest that's happening around civil rights. So this is the height of the Birmingham campaign in the United States. This is just months after Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. And part of what Attorney General Robert Kennedy is trying to achieve is to get the young people who are protesting in the streets of Birmingham to go home. It's also helpful to know that part of the reason why so many young people were participating in the Birmingham campaign is because many of their parents feared reprisals for participating in civil rights activities. Spike Lee's film, Four Little Girls, does an excellent job of explaining why many of the civil rights movement protests were peopled by young individuals in elementary, high school, and middle school. You may wonder why, for example, the famous Four Little Girls of the 16th Street Church, why young people were targeted with that bombing. Well, the reason that they were targeted is because they were the foot soldiers of the movement. And they participated in marches and sit-ins and so forth because they didn't have the same risk of losing their jobs or being penalized by their adult peers in the ways that their parents did. And so Hansberry and Belafonte and Baldwin meet with Attorney General Bobby Kennedy to discuss the civil rights issue. Following their meeting, Hansberry and her friends leave frustrated because they're trying to explain to Bobby Kennedy that he should have a more forceful civil rights position, and his goal is to get them to convince the young people to stop protesting. Hansberry gives a speech in Croton-on-Hudson, which is her home at the time, following the meeting with Bobby Kennedy. And I want to play for you an excerpt from that speech because I think it really crystallizes Hansberry's political investments and some of the ways that she sees the world.
We are one people. Remarks to a civil rights rally, Croton-on-Hudson, New York, June 16, 1963.
My name is Lorraine Hansberry. I'm a writer. I think you know that I am your neighbor in Croton, and I'm very proud of our community. I understand we have more than 100 people outside today. And it's my privilege to be the chairman of this meeting this afternoon, which has assembled all of us here in response to an extraordinary mood in our country, to a very great mood in our country, one which now presumes to finish up the unfinished business of American life, the disgraceful unfinished business of American life, a mood which dares to present to the American people as a whole the fact that while it is proper, as I always do, to observe that there really is no such thing as the new Negro. And I am always emphatic about it because, among other things, I try to be something of an amateur student of Negro history. And there hasn't been a period in the history of this country, or for that matter, the New World, when the Negro people have not fought valiantly, persistently for their freedom. As one person said, it is not particularly new that Negroes are now determined to fight for their voting rights throughout the South. What is new is that the atmosphere in the world is so completely different that the solution that the races used to apply at will, which was simply to drop the insurgents into the local rivers around Dixie, is now different. A new world. And the responsiveness of our people to that fact is the thing I think that draws all of us here this afternoon. The responsiveness of the people of Birmingham, Jackson, and throughout the South, and representatives of which we have with us this afternoon. Finally, I think we are all, if not to the point of exhaustion, heard of the meeting that some people, myself among them, had with the Attorney General of the United States not too long ago. And there were many references that became famous on that occasion. One of them that I'm proud to say, since it was my remark, had significance then, and I'm going to repeat it. Most of us there felt was the telling statement. It was when, during the genuine heat of the discussion, and our speaker today, Mr. Jerome Smith, had indicated to the Attorney General that the passion and the absence of patience of a sorely oppressed Native American people is beyond anything that we can sit around and be polite about anymore. That the Attorney General exhibited some impatience. And it was at that juncture and feeling free that I was speaking for every single Negro and indeed white ally in that room, as there were, that I suggested that the Attorney General re-examine his impatience, because while there might be in that room some of the celebrated figures of whom we all know, the qualitative change in the struggle for Negro freedom was that we are not remotely interested in the old insulting concept of the exceptional Negro. We are not remotely interested in any tea at the White House. That what we are interested in is making perfectly clear that between the Negro intelligentsia and the Negro middle class and the Negro this and that we are one people, and as far as we are concerned, we are represented by the Negroes in the streets of Birmingham.
We are one people.
So one of the things that I think is important to note is that after A Raise in the Sun premiered on Broadway, Hansberry became a overnight sensation, and relatively well known in artistic circles as well as civil rights activities. Prior to that, Hansberry had been actively involved in leftist movements. As I said, she was mentored by W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, Alice Childress, individuals who had been actively part of the Popular Front in the 1940s and 50s, and had been driven underground during the Cold War. As you might recall, both Robeson and Du Bois had their passports revoked. And at one point, Hansberry doesn't have to, but chooses to engage in international travel to represent Robeson because he's not able to travel because his passport has been revoked. And so this is the backdrop to Hansberry becoming well-known and a public figure. One of the ways that she managed her ambivalence about the idea of fame was to constantly remind interviewers, in this case, as she said in the speech, the Attorney General and others, that although people are paying attention to and listening to her because she's well-known, that from her point of view, it's important that we would listen to the people who are on the ground and can give us insight about the change that we want to see. In this case, the students on the streets of Birmingham, as she says. Or as she said when she was in the room with Attorney General Robert Kennedy, Jerome Smith, who was an activist and part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, are also known as SNCC. And so Hansberry used her fame to redirect attention to the young people that she thought were central to the movement and the work that she wanted to accomplish in the world. And I would also want to emphasize that this is not unrelated to the emphasis of her most well-known play. After Raising the Sun, in many interviews, Hansberry was asked why she decided to focus on working class Black people as the representation of Black folks. And one of the things that Hansberry wanted to emphasize was that American dreams had to be open to all Americans, no matter what your station in life. And that she thought that a robust understanding of freedom would have to be a greater democratization of resources and possibilities. And so it was important for Hansberry, from her political as well as artistic investments, to reiterate that time after time. And so you see that both in her artistic work, as well as in her interviews and conversations, and political work as well. Hansberry said, "It is perhaps the task, I should think certainly the joy of the artist, to chisel out some expression of what life can conceivably be." In this quote, Hansberry makes clear that she sees the work of the artist as transforming things that seem immovable. Crafting rock with chisel, carving out a new form from something that seems like it is intractable is part of the work of the artist, and imagining possibilities for transforming objects that seem like they are intractable is the central work of the artist. And so after leaving her meeting with Bobby Kennedy frustrated, Hansberry went to work and began to re-engage with her play Simon Sidney Brewstein's Window, as well as her play LeBlanc. You see Hansberry channeling some of her frustrations with political work into her artistic work at the end of her life. And so I want to end by just offering some of the lessons that I've learned by writing this book, Radical Vision, and also by digging in Hansberry's archive, which I think is a great gift to all of us, that Hansberry's executors have done such a meticulous job of keeping her work alive for all of us to view over time. And so I begin with a quote from Angela Davis, who says, you have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time." The first lesson that I've learned from Hansberry is that change happens through day-to-day choices. Often we think of big moments in history as happening that jet us forward into possibility. The passing of the Voting Rights Act, the Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954. But what a student of the Supreme Court would know, and what Hansberry work teaches us, is that all of those moments in history were prepared for by the hard day-to-day work of individuals setting the foundation for those moments where we seem to leap forward in history. There were several cases that the NAACP tried, for example, that set the foundation for the Brown v. Board of Education decision. And so while in those prior cases, they might have met failure because they did not result in the desegregation of schools, the NAACP was creating a strategy for how they would ultimately get to Brown v. Board. And it was necessary for all of those foundational steps to ultimately get to what we understand as this big leap forward in history. Hansberry understood all of freedom struggles as being structured through day-to-day activities that enable us to have what we understand as these moments where we seem to leap forward in history. The second point, if you have power, your role is to empower someone else. Hopefully that comes forward in the speech, the little snippet of a speech that I played for you of Hansberry, where she was describing her interactions with Robert Kennedy, and also her emphasis on paying attention to what Jerome Smith had taught her. But it comes forward in some of Hansberry's other work as well, when you think about her emphasis in a short story, and she talks about learning from a young man who wanted to be an engineer and his dreams were thwarted, and how important it is to nurture young people's potential to make creative change in the world. The third point, use every strategy at your disposal, emanates in part from Hansberry learning very early on the power of the juridical to make change, how important it would become for the civil rights movement, the power of the courts, but then also Hansberry learning from an early age the limitation of the courts. Her father won the battle, but he lost the war. So Hansberry knew as a child that the courts were not the end-all be-all for civil rights activity, and that there would have to be other strategies alongside of the courts in order to achieve the aims that she wanted. Hansberry also knew that your role is not necessarily to change everyone's mind, but to demonstrate that change was possible. As I mentioned, she often left interactions with political encounters, artistic ones as well, frustrated because she had not been able to communicate to others or change their minds or their point of view. But one of the things that's important about the final scene in Erasing the Sun, on that slide I showed you with Walter Lee Younger talking to the individual from the community, is that his son is looking on as his father is explaining why they will occupy the home. And so although Carl Lindner, the representative from the community, leaves confused as to why the Youngers wouldn't accept his offer to buy the home back, the point is not for Walter Lee to explain or get Carl to understand his point of view, but it's rather to demonstrate to his son, Travis, the possibility of affirmatively acting in the world, of making a decision that will ultimately impact for generations to come. And finally, and of course, this is an old civil rights chestnut, keep your eyes on the prize, that the idea of there will be setbacks, there will be moments where we will fail, there'll be moments where the outcome will not be what one wants, but nevertheless, there are lessons that can be learned from all of these activities that can build towards better outcomes in the future. And so I think that the Supreme Court cases that led up to Brown v. Board of Education is an example of that. We also see this in Hansberry's lesson from her father losing the case, or at least losing the larger structure of the case in terms of desegregation in Hansberry v. Lee, and then Hansberry living to ultimately see desegregation via Brown v. Board of Education. That even though she was not, that her father failed in some ways, ultimately the civil rights activities of her father's generation and Hansberry's generation led to more access for many more people, and the democratization of the United States more generally. So I'm gonna stop there. And I was not as faithful, but I don't think I missed any questions in the chat, but I'm happy now to answer any questions that you might have about Hansberry, her work, or anything that I've said. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting. And I know I learned so much. I really appreciate you sharing such details. Does anybody have any questions? Diana, it looks like you're clapping or hand up.
Yeah, that was a very good. Thank you very much. One question, was there any overlap among their circles between Pauli Murray and Hansberry? Both are in New York.
Sorry to cut you off. I've had that question before. I have not found any evidence that Hansberry knew Pauli Murray, but they definitely had overlapping circles, and were both leftists. And so it's possible, but I haven't been able to locate in the archive them being in the same place at the same time or any letters exchanged between them. But that doesn't mean that they didn't know each other, just that I haven't been able to pinpoint that in the archive. But it's certainly possible given the circles that they were both a part of.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Sylvia.
Hi, thank you very much. That was really wonderful. Thank you for your presentation. I have a question about, I don't know if you have done any research on Paul Marshall. Okay, she was a friend of mine.
Oh,
And yeah, and she used to talk to me about sort of hanging out with Lorraine Hansberry and just that the whole circle. She was younger, but yeah, and it was really fascinating. And in the process of getting to know her, and I've written some articles about her as well, but Paul Marshall. In the process, I remembered, like in a blinding flash several years ago, talking to her about this. My father took me to see A Raisin in the Sun in 1960 in New York. He was going to take my mom, and my mom didn't want to go. It was too late, or I don't remember. She complaining. And I saw it. And my father afterwards, I remember him sitting me down and saying, "So what did you think of the decision? What do you think they should have done?" And for me, the biggest focus was that the mother spent all of that time consulting everybody else and looking at everybody's needs. And I thought she was such a hero in the play. Even at 10, I really thought that. My father, a businessman, thought it was a foolish decision. He could have made so much more money. He could have bought something else, whatever. But it was very interesting. I remember little bits about it. And, I didn't realize I'd become a historical iconic, but like not icon, but that it would become iconic and I would be a dinosaur. But awesome to know that, right? To have been part of that, ideas. If you live long enough, you become history. So yeah, very interesting stuff.
It's so nice to make your acquaintance. Before we're coming on, I said one of the gifts of doing this work has been that I often meet people who saw the first production of A Raisin in the Sun, which is always wonderful to hear their reflections about being in that space, being a part of history. And it's also great to think about how Hansberry, was a part of intergenerational conversation, not just as a student of a prior generation, but then also of, Paul Marshall and others coming after her, and how she influenced them. And I'm glad that you raised Marshall's name into the room because, her heyday is, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, later in the 20th century, but she is one of the Black women writers who really draws our attention to internationalism in important and exciting ways. And so in some ways that is related to Hansberry's interest, although you might not know it readily from Raising the Sun because there's just this one character. If you look at her larger body of work, she's really thinking about, as I said before, independence movements and the relationship between what's happening in the US and other parts of the world, which obviously is an interest of Marshall's as well. So, wow. So nice to meet you virtually.
Yeah, nice to meet you too. I wish that, Paul was around still and to hear you, but she would have great things, interesting things to say. So.
I'm sure. And, the other thing I guess that is useful to know is that, during that time period, you had really well-known people, but they were still frequenting, that there was a tight-knit community in New York of artists and activists who often got together, hung out in the same places, were in community and conversation together. And so although they were well-known figures, fame didn't operate in the same way as it does in our contemporary moment.
Yeah, Langston Hughes also was, she talked about him also, just vaguely, but there were stories.
There's a lovely letter that the Beinecke has circulated between Langston Hughes and Nina Simone. And as I mentioned at the beginning, Hansberry gets her line for Raising the Sun from Hughes's poem. And so Hughes mentored Hansberry and Simone as well, and was a good friend to them. And some of that history you can find in Hughes's papers at the Beinecke at Yale University.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I love hearing the different connections. It's always amazing how it doesn't even take those 6 degrees of separation sometimes, right? Any other questions for Soyica or anything else to discuss? Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being here. That was such an interesting lecture, and I'm so grateful. Thank you all for attending, and I look forward to seeing you all again soon.
Thank
Thank you very much.
you.
Have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.